The tragedy of Friday the 13th, the true story of the cursed house. This story dates back to the Soviet Union era. In the house where it all happened, there lived an old woman known to the villagers for her reclusive nature and strange rituals. On the night of Friday the 13th, the 90-year-old woman died in terrible agony. Her neighbors claimed to hear unearthly screams echoing through the night. Before her death, she had bequeathed her house to her 20-year-old great-granddaughter on the condition that the young woman accept her supernatural abilities. Despite the eerie rumors surrounding her great-grandmother, the young heir and her family moved into the house shortly after her passing. However, the granddaughter never embraced the witch's powers, dismissing the whispers about dark magic as old superstitions. On the 40th day after the witch's death, tragedy struck. One day, a neighbor who lived across the street decided to meet the new family. She knocked on the door for a long time, but no one answered. Just as the woman was about to leave, the door creaked open by itself. She stepped inside, but the house was eerily empty. A strange chill filled the air, and the neighbor swore she heard faint whispers coming from the shadows. This mysterious occurrence repeated for several days. Determined to uncover the truth, the neighbor began asking other villagers if they had seen the family. But no one had. The entire village soon mobilized to search for the missing family. Despite their efforts, after a week of fruitless searching, the villagers gave up, leaving the mystery unsolved. That night, the neighbor couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, her thoughts racing, when suddenly she heard strange noises. A rhythmic tapping sound echoed in the silence. Looking out her window, she saw a shadowy figure entering the house of the missing family. Terrified, she rushed outside, clutching a lantern. As she approached the house, she saw the figure leap out of the window with inhuman speed and disappear into the darkness. Summoning her courage, the neighbor entered the house. What she saw froze her blood. Inside were the horribly mutilated bodies of the three family members: the husband, the wife, who was the great-granddaughter, and their child. All three had their eyes gouged out, and on every mirror in the house, the name of the old sorceress was written in blood. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and an unshakable feeling of dread. The family was buried together in a small cemetery on the edge of the village. After the funeral, the neighbor, out of habit, entered the ominous house once more, determined to find some explanation for the horror she had witnessed. To her horror, she saw the same sinister silhouette staring directly at her from the corner of the room. The figure's glowing eyes burned with an otherworldly intensity. That night, the villagers heard blood-curdling screams coming from the house, but no one dared to enter. The neighbor was never seen again. Over the years, the house became a source of dark legends and rumors. People claimed to see shadows moving in the windows and hear faint whispers in the night. Some said that the spirit of the old sorceress haunted the house, enraged that her powers had been rejected. Others believed it was a curse placed upon the family for breaking the pact. The village priest attempted to bless the house, but he fled halfway through the ritual, pale and trembling, refusing to speak of what he had experienced inside. Despite its sinister reputation, a few curious individuals ventured into the house over the decades. They would return shaken, often refusing to speak of what they saw. One man claimed that when he looked into a cracked mirror in the house, he saw not his reflection but the faces of the murdered family, their hollow eyes staring back at him. Another reported hearing a chilling voice that whispered his name, urging him to leave. A group of teenagers, hoping to debunk the myths, stayed overnight in the house. By morning, only one returned to the village, muttering incoherently about a woman in black and a circle of mirrors that seemed to trap him. In recent years, the house has been boarded up and officially declared uninhabitable. Yet locals say that on certain nights, especially during storms, faint lights can be seen flickering in the windows. Some claim that if you stand near the house at midnight, you can hear faint, mournful cries and the soft hum of an old lullaby drifting through the air. On the anniversary of the family's death, the phenomena intensify. Witnesses report seeing the silhouette of a woman wandering the property, her head tilted unnaturally as if she were searching for something. No one knows for sure what happened in that house or what force continues to linger there. But one thing is certain, it remains a place shrouded in mystery and fear, a chilling reminder of a dark and tragic past. The house now serves as a warning to all who dare to meddle with forces beyond their understanding, its dark secrets locked away, waiting to claim the next victim who dares to step inside.
The Cursed House, a Mystery Beneath the Foundation. My wife Sarah had always dreamed of living in her own house, so one day I decided to make that dream come true. We built her perfect home, a spacious modern house in an upscale neighborhood. The yard was big, complete with a pool, and the interior design was straight out of a magazine. Everything brand new and luxurious. It was supposed to be our forever home. At first, everything seemed perfect. Sarah was thrilled. Our 6-year-old son Timmy loved his new room, and even our 2 Rottweilers had plenty of space to roam. But not long after we moved in, Sarah began to feel uneasy. She said there was something wrong with the house. I brushed it off as her imagination at first, but then I started noticing things too. At night, the curtains in the living room would sway as if caught in a breeze, even though all the windows were shut. Sometimes the temperature in the house would drop suddenly, even though the heating system was working just fine. And worst of all was the oppressive feeling, like someone was watching you, even when you were alone. Our dogs, usually fearless and protective, started acting strange. They would whimper and hide in Timmy's room every night. Eventually, Sarah started sleeping in there with Timmy and the dogs because it was the only place in the house where she felt safe. I thought it was all in her head until something happened to me. One night I woke up with a heavy, suffocating pressure on my chest. I opened my eyes and saw a white cat sitting on me. It was calmly licking its paws, like nothing was out of the ordinary. But the longer it sat there, the harder it was for me to breathe. When I finally sat up, the cat was gone, but the fear lingered. I decided we needed a break. We took a trip to Europe for a few weeks, leaving my older son Jason from my first marriage to look after the house. Jason, being the party-loving 20-something he was, wasted no time inviting his friends over for a rager. But the party didn't last. The next morning, Jason and his friends bolted from the house, jumping into their cars and speeding away like they'd seen a ghost. When I asked him what happened, all he could talk about was that same white cat. How could a little cat scare a house full of young adults? I was determined to figure out what was going on. We called in priests, paranormal investigators, anyone who might help. Nothing worked. Then I uncovered the most disturbing part of the story. During construction, one of the workers had fallen ill and died on site. He didn't have any ID and no one knew where he was from or how to contact his family. Instead of reporting it, the crew buried him right there on the property. But where? No one could remember. I decided to search for his remains to give him a proper burial. We dug up the yard, but nothing turned up. Then I realized the body might have been left in the foundation of the house itself. By that point, it was clear we couldn't stay. The house had become unbearable. We sold it and Sarah was devastated. She couldn't take a single thing from the house to our new apartment. It was like everything was tainted. The only thing I kept was a set of red curtains from the living room. They were beautiful and expensive, and I thought they'd be perfect in our new place. But after a few weeks, I noticed the curtains moving, even when the windows were closed. Sometimes I thought I saw shadows behind them. I threw them out. The house, as far as I know, still stands empty. I don't know who bought it or what happened to them, but I'll never forget that white cat. Who or what was it? The Forbidden Threshold, the mystery behind the door. 15-year-old Anna lived with her father in a small house on the outskirts of a picturesque European village. After her mother's death, her father became her only support. They were inseparable, spending evenings together reading books, taking walks in the forest, and talking about life. But one morning, her father told her he had to go on a business trip to a nearby city and would return very late, possibly even at midnight. He kissed her on the forehead, grabbed his briefcase, and left the house. After school, Anna did her homework as usual, prepared dinner, and sat down to watch TV. By midnight, her father still hadn't returned, so she decided to go to bed. That night, she had a strange dream. She was standing on the edge of a busy highway somewhere in the Alps. Cars and trucks sped past at insane speeds. On the other side of the road, she saw a familiar figure. It was her father. He was shouting something at her, but the roar of traffic drowned out his words. As the noise subsided, she finally heard his voice. "Don't open the door." Suddenly, Anna woke up to a loud knocking at the door. She jumped out of bed, threw on her robe, and ran to the entrance. Peeking through the peephole, she saw her father's face. He was standing there, staring straight at her. The doorbell kept ringing. "Daddy, I'm coming," she called out. She reached for the lock, but suddenly hesitated. Something about his expression seemed off. His eyes were wide open, filled with terror. A chill ran down her spine. Slowly, she slid the lock back into place. "Daddy!" she shouted. "Did you forget your keys? Ding dong! Daddy, answer me! Ding dong! Daddy, please, say something! Ding dong! Is someone there with you? Ding dong! Why aren't you speaking? Ding dong! I won't open the door until you answer." The terrifying discovery. The knocking continued, but her father never spoke. Anna spent the rest of the night curled up in the corner of the hallway, listening to the endless ringing. At dawn, the sounds finally stopped. She cautiously approached the door and looked through the peephole again. Her father was still standing there. Panic swelled inside her. She hesitated, but eventually, overcoming her fear, she slowly unlocked the door and screamed in horror. Nailed to the door right at the level of the peephole was her father's severed head. His widened eyes still glistened with fresh tears. A small note hung from the doorbell with a chilling message. "Smart girl." Anna stumbled backward, choking on her own breath. The house was engulfed in eerie silence. She didn't dare step past the threshold. One terrifying thought consumed her mind. If Daddy is dead, then who stood outside the door all night? The Night Visitor. After a long and exhausting work week, I decided to escape the city as usual and retreat to my small cabin in the woods. It stood alone, surrounded by trees, my personal sanctuary. I loaded my car with groceries and a few personal belongings before heading out. By the time I arrived, the sun had already begun to set. Tired from the journey, I didn't even bother turning on the lights. I just collapsed into bed and fell into a deep sleep. A sudden piercing sound shattered my rest. The car alarm was blaring. My heart pounded in my chest. I sat up, dazed, trying to shake off the drowsiness. Maybe an animal brushed against it, I thought, peeking out the window. The yard was empty. Nothing seemed out of place. I turned off the alarm, sighed, and lay back down. 5 minutes later, the alarm went off again. Now I was getting nervous. I grabbed the remote and silenced it once more, trying to convince myself that it was just a glitch. But then, for the third time, the alarm screamed into the night. A chill ran down my spine. In a secluded forest like this, it couldn't be going off randomly. I hesitantly pulled the curtain back and froze. In the dim glow of the porch light, something moved in the bushes. At first, it was just a shadow, shifting between the trees. Then it took shape. A tall, unnaturally thin figure stepped into the light. It was draped in a long, black cloak with a deep hood. Its arms were long and skeletal, dangling at its sides. Its posture was hunched, and its slow, deliberate movement sent waves of terror through me. It approached my car, lifted one frail-looking hand, and tapped on the wheel. Then it stood motionless, listening. Moments later, it turned and retreated into the darkness. I was shaking. Did I imagine that? Was it real? My mind raced, but the fear gripping my body assured me this was no dream. Then I saw it again. This time it was at the gate. A single bony arm stretched over the top, and with an eerie ease, it slid the latch open. The gate creaked as it swung ajar. It was coming toward the house. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move, and then its face appeared in the window. It was the most horrifying sight I had ever witnessed. Ash-gray skin, deeply wrinkled and lifeless. Tiny, beady black eyes like polished stones stared inside. It had no lips, just rows of sharp, yellowed teeth gleaming under the pale moonlight. Its breathing was heavy, raspy. The window fogged with each exhale, and for a moment I was grateful. Maybe the condensation would shield me from its gaze. Then came the knocking, soft at first, then harder. The doorknob rattled violently. Through the gap under the door, I saw thin, grotesque fingers reaching inside, feeling for an opening. And then, it spoke. The sound wasn't human. It was a deep, guttural growl, like a wild animal snarling when its meal is threatened. A sound filled with hatred and hunger. I stayed completely still, holding my breath. I don't know how long it lasted. Minutes? Hours? But eventually, the noise stopped. The presence outside my door vanished. At some point, I must have passed out. When I woke, daylight streamed through the window. I sat up, barely believing I had survived the night. But as I approached the door, my stomach dropped. The handle was broken. Deep scratches covered the wood, as if something had tried to claw its way inside. I rushed to the window. The gate stood wide open. Wooden planks from the fence lay scattered across the path. My nightmare had been real. I grabbed my keys and bolted for the car. As I stepped outside, my eyes fell to the ground. Footprints, long, narrow imprints leading into the woods. I didn't waste a second. I jumped into my car and sped away, my hands trembling on the wheel. As I drove, I turned on the radio, trying to drown out the fear clawing at my mind. That's when I heard the news. This morning, in a nearby forest, the bodies of 2 young women were discovered. Their remains were mutilated and dumped in the swamp. My breath caught in my throat. It found someone else. The voice behind the door. One evening, when I was home alone, I got bored and decided to invite my friend over for a sleepover. I called Emily and convinced her to come, even though she hesitated because of the cold. We agreed that she would be there soon. Half an hour passed. I heard a knock on the door and Emily's trembling voice. "Open up, I'm freezing." Her voice sounded genuinely cold and desperate. I was sure it was her since she had complained about the freezing weather earlier. My hands were wet, so I shouted for her to wait a second. But the voice behind the door repeated, "I'm freezing." With each second, it grew louder, more demanding, as if it wasn't a request but an order. I thought Emily was messing with me, so I deliberately walked to the door slowly, slightly annoyed. And then, my phone rang. Her name lit up on the screen. Confused, I answered, "I'm coming. Why are you yelling?" But Emily's voice on the phone sounded puzzled. "Coming where?" "I'm so sorry, but I can't make it tonight." I froze. I was already standing by the door, my hand reaching for the lock. My mind raced. If she's not here, then who is outside? "I'll call you back," I whispered and hung up. The house fell into an eerie silence. I stood there, my back against the door, while Emily's voice continued from the other side. "I'm freezing. Let me in. I'm freezing." It sounded like a broken record now. Trembling, I felt an unbearable urge to look through the peephole. Summoning all my courage, I stepped forward and peered through it. What I saw was indescribable. That was not Emily. That was something horrifying. It couldn't be human. Its eyes, or what should have been eyes, were hollow, empty. Its skin was pale, almost bluish, as if it had been decaying. but the worst part was its mouth. When it spoke again, its lips moved in a grotesque, unnatural way, like it was struggling to mimic human speech. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. Then suddenly the voice stopped. Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. I barely breathed. And then, scratching. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, drilling into my mind like a scream. I wanted to yell, but my throat was paralyzed with fear. The scratching turned into pounding. "I'm cold. Let me in." The voice was no longer Emily's. It was low, guttural, monstrous. The banging grew violent. I thought the door would break. I curled up against the wall, shaking, tears streaming down my face. Then, it stopped. Silence pressed against my ears. I was too terrified to move. It felt like hours had passed, though it was probably seconds. Then my phone vibrated in my trembling hands. A message. It was blank, and from an unknown number. I stared at the screen, my mind spiraling. Just then, my phone rang again. Emily. I flinched but answered. Her voice was casual. "Why are you so quiet? Is everything okay?" I tried to speak, and I could. My voice was weak and hoarse, but I managed to ask her to come over. She sensed something was wrong and agreed. As she walked to my house, we talked on the phone. Slowly, I started calming down. I even managed to stand up and take a few steps. When she told me she was in my building, I finally exhaled in relief. The doorbell rang. No knocking. Just the bell. Without hesitation, I ran to the door, wiping away my tears. I wanted nothing more than to hug her and finally feel safe. I swung the door open and froze. That thing was standing there, holding my dead friend in its arms.
Thank you for watching this story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss any new creepy legends and mystical tales. There's a lot more to come, so stay tuned and be ready for more encounters with the unknown. Look out for the next story.